Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Butler. I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, through which I conduct water research, provide facilitation and mediation services, training, and recruiting for water executives. You can find out more about Collaborative Water Resolution at waterdisputes.org. My guest today is Martha Pskowski, a Texas reporter for Inside Climate News who is based in El Paso. Martha reports on water, oil, and gas and the impacts of climate change. She was previously an environmental reporter at the El Paso Times and a freelance reporter in Mexico City. Martha, welcome back to Talk+Water.
Good to be back, Todd.
And so this is a quick return that listeners to the podcast will no doubt recognize. And I asked you to come back soon because there's some developments on the Rio Grande that I'd like to talk about. But let's go ahead and kind of start out with, kind of the water situation on the Rio Grande, Elephant Butte in southern New Mexico, and then the international reservoirs, Amistad and Falcon. What are the situation in terms of storage with those reservoirs?
Things are looking better than last summer, which is relative. Still not out of the woods, but down at Amistad and Falcon, their storage has improved. Gotten some good storms this summer, some deliveries from Mexico. So Amistad's at 33% and Falcon's at 15. So last summer they were near record lows, but they've improved somewhat. But it's a pretty different story if you look at Elephant Butte and southern New Mexico. Elephant Butte is at less than 4% right now. So, we just had Labor Day weekend. It's a big boating destination, and I was seeing some local news reports that people were running up on sandbars, and there's
Gosh,
barely enough water to get your boat out there at this
right,
point. So that's due to the snow melt coming down from Colorado, and the problem really extends up towards Albuquerque. The river's been dry downstream of Albuquerque for over a month now. So, really, some of the driest conditions on the river in New Mexico in quite a long time. So, kind of depending what spot you're looking at, it's a pretty different story right now.
right, all right. I keep seeing, I mean, the 5% number at Elephant Butte or less, right? And I've gotten so used to it being at 5%, I kind of wonder what it would be like if it was actually close to 100%. I mean, um, I'm not sure when it was last at 100%, but I imagine it's been quite a while. Um, I
Yeah, and
as
it's one of those reservoirs where you see sort of the bathtub rings. So if you look
Right,
at the photos right now, you can tell it's just so low, but it's been that way for a while now.
right, right. And thinking about Amistad and Falcon, I multiple times I saw there was a hurricane or tropical storm that was projected to kind of go up the Rio Grande and hit both those areas and get in the watersheds above there and provide some rainfall. And I kept thinking, okay, well maybe, gosh, here's going to be a big you know, recharge event for those reservoirs. And it seems like both times they just totally fizzled out. One of them, somebody sent me you know, an email with the projection from the National Hurricane Center, and it's like, oh, look, this is like 2 or 3 days away. And then I looked at, the Hurricane Center's website like 2 days later, and it was gone. Like it just fell apart. And so I know that people who are kind of clamoring for uh, you know additional storage in those reservoirs. It's kind of a strange thing, right? To be thinking about, I wish we had a hurricane come up here, given all the devastation associated with hurricanes. But um, but I guess it demonstrates, how desperate that region is.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a refrain you hear about the conflict with Mexico that, if we just get a good hurricane in that area with the reservoirs, it'll wash away some of these issues. But, there was never one big storm. It seems like it's been very localized. Like the Big Bend region has gotten some good rain this summer. Saw some great photos and videos of people out rafting on the Rio Grande, but never quite hit that area around Amistad.
So, how's Mexico's reservoirs on the Rio Conchos, uh, which is a tributary of the Rio Grande? Are they in similar condition?
Pretty similar story. It's the monsoon season still in Chihuahua, so they've gotten some rain. The reservoirs aren't quite as low as last year. La Boquilla is at 27% now, and then the other two main reservoirs in Chihuahua on the Conchos are at around 55%. So they did have restrictions for irrigated agriculture this year. Um, and we are coming up on that 5-year cycle for the treaty, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So, clearly not enough water sitting in those reservoirs right now to fulfill all of Mexico's obligations.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about that next then. As you mentioned, we're nearing the 5-year cycle. Um, and I don't know if there have been any developments with regard to the water debt since we spoke in July, but why don't you tell us first so that, for those who are not totally familiar with that issue, what the water debt, what that means and what that 5-year cycle is, and then tell us if there are any updates with regard to that whole issue.
Right. So this is under the water treaty between the U.S. and Mexico. Um, on the Rio Grande, Mexico sends water to the U.S. On the Colorado River, they get water from the U.S. Um, but this 5-year cycle will come to an end in October, and Mexico has those 5 years to deliver its 1.7 million acre feet of water. And this was in the news a lot last year, earlier this year. They're very far behind. And I can report that, since we last talked, there has been some more water um, transferred over to the US. My understanding is that's mostly water in the reservoirs that's Mexico has kind of said on paper, now this belongs to the US. Um, and there was an agreement that EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin was down in Mexico City. They signed an agreement with Mexican officials to, try and speed up the water deliveries this year to the U.S. So the International Boundary and Water Commission, that's the federal agency that handles these agreements with Mexico and is out there measuring water flows. So they have a handy chart on their website that gets updated. And Mexico's deliveries to the US have been creeping up over the last couple months, but they're still far behind that 5-year target. So um, the deadline's only a month away and they're not going to hit it, but there is a provision that they can get an extra 5 years during extreme drought. So looks like that's, where this is headed. And we'll see in October if the US, um, is satisfied with what Mexico has done to catch up or if they're going to, um, try and get a bit more water out of them.
So I think because we hear so often about the 1944 treaty with Mexico with regard to the Rio Grande um, issue, that people sometimes kind of lose sight of the fact that that treaty is not only about the Rio Grande, it's also about the Colorado River and the Tijuana River, and because of that, implementing uh, some of the issues in one river basin as opposed to one of those others is maybe not always as clear cut. I mean, my impression always is, well, the management of that treaty, often requires, uh, you know, some consideration for what's going on in these other basins when you're talking about the, international relation aspect of it. Uh, and so, I know that we now have a new uh, U.S. IBWC commissioner, and that Maria Elena Guinea has been replaced by the new commissioner. Can you tell me anything about the new commissioner?
Yeah, his name is Chad McIntosh. And this is sort of an interesting agency. The commissioner always has to be an engineer, um, kind of a specific background. I've interviewed Commissioner Kinnear a few times, so I haven't met the new commissioner yet. Um, but, if anything, it seems that the sewage situation on the Tijuana River is what's really capturing their attention right now. There's been a lot of announcements around the wastewater treatment plant, and preventing more sewage from flowing into California. I think there were announcements around the Rio Grande earlier this year, but it's kind of quieted down the last few weeks or month or two. Um, and speaking to the Colorado River, there are, agreements made on the Colorado River that I think stakeholders on the Rio Grande would like to explore of, if we know that every 5-year cycle we're coming up against this problem that Mexico hasn't sent enough water, how can we, you know, find some mutually beneficial agreements that, change the expectations to maybe be more realistic. Um, but IBWC certainly has their hands full with a lot of cross-border issues. And so far the new commissioner, I haven't heard too much about him, but I'm sure over the next few years we'll get to know him better.
So on top of all that, or maybe it's below all that, I don't know which one to say. There is a state compact between Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado over the Rio Grande, and of course that has been uh, the subject of a lot of litigation uh, over the decades, and more recently litigation uh, that has been pending before the Supreme Court. Of course, any litigation over the compact goes to the Supreme Court, and so there have that the current lawsuit I think is, I don't know how many years it's been going on, but it's I don't know, several years it seems like, and now uh, there's a development with regard to that which is significant. Can you tell us about that?
So to explain the case in the broadest terms, this came about because Texas alleged that New Mexico was not delivering its full share of water that Texas is owed under the Rio Grande Compact. So the area that's really in question is in southern New Mexico, downstream of Elephant Butte, where uh, agriculture expanded. There were some periods of drought, and farmers started drilling a lot more wells. So the main argument from Texas is that these wells are siphoning off water that's supposed to keep flowing downstream to Texas. So this case started in 2013, and now 12 years later, it looks like it is finally going to come to a close. There were a few false starts. There was another settlement at the end of 2022 that was ultimately struck down by the Supreme Court. So all of the parties came back together and now have 4 different settlements that will make up the ultimate resolution to this case if all goes according to plan. Um, and on Friday, I got a call from the irrigation district general manager here in El Paso, and he was just really excited that they'd finally signed this and were could see the end of the tunnel, the light at the end of the tunnel. Um, and in kind of general terms, the settlement will make some modifications for New Mexico to reduce groundwater pumping in that area in southern New Mexico, and also to allow for transfers of water rights. So, um, Elephant Butte Reservoir, that's where the water is released for southern New Mexico, far west Texas, and also a little bit of water goes to Mexico. So there's this 100-mile stretch where the water's already been released for Texas, but it has to travel 100 miles down to the state line. So the irrigation district in that part of New Mexico is the Elephant Butte Irrigation District, and some of their water rights under this settlement can be transferred to the El Paso Irrigation District to make sure that New Mexico meets its obligation to Texas. The settlement also states that Elephant Butte Irrigation District will get some form of compensation. So basically, we're looking at some of those water rights being transferred over to Texas, and New Mexico will compensate those people who will lose access. Um, and the federal government has also signed on to this. That was sort of the sticking point with the previous settlement. So we can go into as much detail as you'd like, but those are the general terms of what's been signed, and it'll be going to the special master, who's the judge appointed by the Supreme Court to oversee this case. So at the end of this month, he'll be having a hearing with presentations on the settlement. And if it gets his seal of approval, then the Supreme Court has the final say. But with all the parties on board, there really shouldn't be any reason that it would be sent back at this point.
Gotcha. So I have a bunch of questions. So now this case has had multiple special masters. I think at one point special master was maybe from New Orleans, and now the special master, if it's the same judge as I think a federal judge in maybe Iowa.
So there was a new special master appointed at the end of the last year.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm not sure if this is the third or the fourth, but they've really been all over the country. This is D. Brooks Smith. So he's in the Third District Court of Appeals in Pennsylvania. So everyone will be headed out to Philadelphia at the end of this month for the hearing in the courthouse there. But
That explains
prior,
something.
yeah.
I saw a post by uh, the TCQ chairman, Brooke Powell, said, "We're heading to Philadelphia." And I was like, okay, now why would they be going there? Uh, and so that explains why. Gotcha.
Yeah, the prior special master was in Iowa, and at one point there was a trial scheduled for Cedar Rapids courthouse. So that didn't end up happening, but they can really be sent all over the country depending where the special master is.
And so you mentioned that there are four separate settlements. What's that about?
So this case started out Texas v. New Mexico. Then, because Colorado is also part of the compact, Colorado becomes a defendant, and the U.S., the United States, intervenes. And then we've got the irrigation districts who were amici, so friends of the court, and a few different agricultural organizations. Um, so what started out as a dispute between two states now has all of these different actors involved. And the Department of Justice, they are they've signed on to this settlement with the state of New Mexico and the irrigation districts. That's the one that I um, read through on Friday, though they're all now up on the docket if anyone wants to dive into that 400-page PDF.
Oh, is that all 400 pages?
there's a few documents, but that looks like the primary one.
Gotcha.
And you better have a law degree if you want to
Right.
make heads or tails of it. So the federal government's concern is that um, the Rio Grande project, which is the Bureau of Reclamation's operations on the Rio Grande, could be infringed by New Mexico's groundwater pumping. So, one agreement is New Mexico, federal government, and the irrigation districts, where New Mexico has satisfied the federal government's concerns that they're going to cut back groundwater pumping. Then we have Texas and New Mexico, the original um, parties in this case. So they've agreed to a framework for water accounting. There's going to be a new gauge installed at the state line, so that will address sort of this problem of the water being released for Texas so far upstream from Texas. Um,
Before you go on to the next point, let's just talk about that quickly. People are, I'm sure, kind of wondering, well, why is the water that Texas receives being delivered from a dam that's over 100 miles, river miles into New Mexico? And I've always wondered about that myself. I don't know who in Texas agreed to, we'll let it be measured at the dam, at Elephant Butte Dam, instead of at the state border. But boy, that created a lot of problems agreeing to that. And so, just for a little bit more background for our listeners who are not familiar with this issue, the water's released at Elephant Butte Dam, and since that started happening, there are a lot of agricultural um, uh, organizations, interests, just farmers, whoever, who have been drilling groundwater wells, shallow groundwater wells into the alluvium of the Rio Grande. And so, you know, it's essentially they're pumping surface water when they do that, but when it becomes groundwater is an issue, and states treat that differently. And I'm sure if somebody is listening to this podcast in New Mexico, they'll say, well, Texas doesn't treat surface and groundwater is the same because of the rule of capture, right? And so um, that's a point I'm sure that they bring up frequently. But with regard to this treaty and the implementation of this treaty, it's a problem to make sure that the water which is acquired under the compact, that amount of water reaches the tech border between New Mexico and Texas. And it sounds like that's finally been resolved by a gauge being placed at the border, and the amount of water reaching Texas is being measured there.
right. And there's a law professor, Bert Griggs in Kansas, who's been really helpful in me understanding these issues. We have a state conflict, but this also is really a conflict between the surface water users and the groundwater users. Because if you have a farm, in the Mesilla Valley in New Mexico, and you're mostly relying on wells, your concern is, oh, am I going to have to shut down my wells? Whereas the farmers who get irrigation water from the surface water in the river, their fear is, are these wells taking away the water that's supposed to be coming to me? So we've got, a lot of different interests in this case all wrapped up together. And that's, why you see this multi-pronged settlement to address the concerns of all these different parties. And the federal government as well, which operates this irrigation infrastructure from Elephant Butte to get the water down to everybody. And a piece of water goes to Mexico and Ciudad Juarez. So, we don't want to wade into another international conflict in this area.
Right, right. And so it sounds like I guess maybe the state of New Mexico will be compensating some groundwater users for the loss of their wells. Um, and and then some water rights are going to be moved to different places uh, and exchanged. And so there's a lot of moving parts, it sounds like.
Yeah, there's going to be a transfer system. I haven't read through all the details on this yet, but there was a previous Texas v. New Mexico case on the Pecos River. And I think, in a general way, the outcome will be somewhat similar because on the Pecos River, New Mexico had to retire a lot of water rights. And, it cost them millions of dollars to compensate the people who've been using that water. But, it was necessary to get the water to Texas on the Pecos River. So we're pretty much talking about a similar situation on the Rio Grande. But you also have cities like El Paso, Las Cruces, Albuquerque that are following this to see if it's going to mean any changes for their existing water sources.
Well, if it would just snow like crazy in southern Colorado, you know, maybe we wouldn't have to be worrying about, you know, irrigation supplies for New Mexico and Texas every year.
That would be nice. We can cross our fingers for some good snow.
Well, anything else about this case you want to tell us about before we wrap up?
No, I think we hit the main points. I'll be, reading more of the documents that have been posted. I don't think I'll make it out to Philadelphia, so hopefully there's a water reporter out there who sits through this hearing with the special master. Um, but, all signs are pointing to the case getting wrapped up pretty soon, which,
Good.
people have been hoping for a while. So, there's going to be a lot of details to sort out, but overall, it's good news that it can move forward.
12 years. Go ahead. And then after uh, action is taken in Philadelphia, then it goes before the Supreme Court. Um, and I don't know if there'll be any parties objecting to that. Um, I mean, none of the parties engage in the litigation, it looks like, but I don't know if other outside parties can object, or if that's even an issue. But we'll keep track of that too, to have the kind of final bow put on all this. And I tell you what, we'll make sure and get back together on Talk+Water in a year or two to see what's happened in terms of the implementation of this, because I'm fascinated to see how it goes after the settlements approved in Philadelphia and then I suppose by the U.S. Supreme Court. Uh, will it be as smooth as everybody hopes, or will there be a whole new set of issues that arise from the implementation of the settlement?
Right. And, just tracking who exactly is going to have their water right retired or transferred. Certainly something I want to be following and, what that means for agriculture in the area and all that. So look forward to talking about that again.
Great. So our final question is, how can our listeners find out more about your work?
All my stories are on insideclimatenews.org. We're a nonprofit news outlet, so those stories are also available to be republished elsewhere. You can find them often in Texas Tribune, San Antonio Express News, and then I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, all the usual social media platforms. If people want to follow my posts there.
Great. Well, I encourage my listeners to check out Martha's other work on those websites and social media platforms because you've done a lot of interesting stuff, and I always enjoy reading it. So thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you, Todd.
So this has been Talk+Water, and my guest today was Martha Pskowski, a reporter for Inside Climate News, who's based in El Paso. She reports on water, oil, and gas, and the impacts of climate change. I want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. Finally, I want to give a big thank you to Anna Jones and Sarah Wingfield at the Meadow Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talk+Water ready to go. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please leave us a review and let us know what you think, and subscribe to the podcast so that you get it every time we post a new one. My name is Todd Bottler. Let's talk water again soon.